My name is Rainer Eudeikis, and I'm the principal cellist of the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra. And what that essentially means is that I'm the leader of the section that I'm also a part of. I sit at the front of the section. It's a very prominent position. If you come to a concert, you'll see me right up front. So what the title of principal cellist essentially means is that I'm the leader of the section, of which I'm also a part, and I serve more than anything as a liaison and an advocate for the section when dealing with the conductor and their needs and wants and coordination with other sections in the orchestra. A lot of my job is essentially unspoken, at least on stage. A lot of it is preparation. You'd be surprised at the number of hours that go into preparing the parts with the bowings, which direction we move our bows, because we all have to be coordinated in that. So I'll get the dreaded stack of parts from the other higher string sections that have already been bowed, and then it's my job to coordinate as best as I can, given the needs of our instruments, to have everyone move more or less in sync. And then when I'm on stage, most of the actual leadership is more by doing than saying. It's showing instead of telling. Sometimes though, there are a lot of people on stage, it's a big stage, during a rehearsal, there's all kinds of activity going on, and sometimes you do have to just turn around and, it's actually simplest just to say, hey guys, let's make sure that we listen for this, or let's change that to an up bow or a down bow in the simplest, most concise way that I can. So preparation for a given program, a given week with the symphony usually is actually begun several weeks in advance. It begins usually with bowings, because the way we do bowings is that usually the first violinist, so the concertmaster, will bow the first violin part, and then the second violinist, the principal second violin, will take that and bow their part, and so on to the violas, and then it comes to me. And the interesting thing about cello bowings is that we're the first one in the procession that instead of holding our instruments like this, hold them like this. So there are inherent differences that sometimes require us to do something a little different than maybe a violin or a viola would. But in general, especially if we're playing the same music, it's my job to try to make our coordination line up with the other sections. And then, of course, after I finish, my parts go to the bass section. And then after the bowings are done, as we get closer to the actual week that we start rehearsal, I have to really dive into preparing the works, and that starts with getting the paper in front of me, reading the notes, sort of figuring out just the lay of the land. There's a lot of score study where I'll sit down with the part, put on my headphones, go through it, listening to a recording or several recordings to sort of know if it's a piece that I haven't played before, especially to know what maybe to expect, what a conductor might ask for. Always trying to sort of be one step ahead to try to anticipate so that you can most effectively keep the section gelling with what's going on in rehearsal. And then that preparation, the practicing, the listening, doesn't necessarily stop even after the first rehearsal, because especially if you're playing some really difficult music, you have to keep it in shape and fresh and dialed in for the entire week until the last note of the last concert. So it's a long process, and most of what we do happens off stage and you never even see it. One major aspect of the preparation is also juggling that workload. You've got a week in front of you where you're doing 2 Nielsen symphonies and some difficult concerto or overture, but next week you have something that's even more difficult with even more notes. So that comes into play with your practicing and your preparation too. You might know, page 37 of whatever we're playing next week has that really, really difficult thing on it. And you might need to spend a few days this week at half tempo really sort of getting to know those notes, because you know that it's not going to be enough time if you procrastinate, right? I mean, my desk, there's a bowing stack usually, and then there's the practice stack, and then there's another practice stack that's even further in advance where maybe I don't even have the parts yet, but I have an old part that I've used or something just to sort of get my head and my hands around what's to come. So principal playing is a very specific demonstrative type of playing that doesn't always come naturally. It comes from experience. And I remember when I first started sitting in a principal chair, even when I was a student in high school or early college, and being in the chair and thinking like, oh, I'm so great, I'm in the principal chair. But it really dawned on me that I had no idea what I was doing at first. I like to think that now I do. But at the time, there were doubts. And it's one thing to sit in a practice room, or even with a small group, in a chamber music group, a string quartet or something, and you're responsible for yourself. And all you have to do is keep yourself in check and be prepared, and you're good to go. But as soon as you have a section of 9, 10 people behind you that are relying on you showing and transmitting information from the podium or elsewhere on stage that they need to do their jobs well, and for us to play together as a section, it's a lot of responsibility, and there is a certain kind of body language that is required. I mean, for example, if you think the big recitative from Beethoven 9 with the cello section and the bass section as well, if the principal of the section is just sitting there worrying about themselves, everyone behind that person is just going to be lost at sea. So you really have to demonstrate and be incisive. I think that's the word that comes to mind, as incisive. Just really showing, like, here it is, as much as you can. If I were to play that recitative without any excess motion, without trying to lead anything, it would be difficult to follow. So since that might be a little bit difficult to follow, especially from behind me, ideally I would play it with more demonstrative sort of physicality, because even though there's a good chance that everyone in the section is going to feel it in a similar way, for us to really play together as one cohesive unit, there just needs to be that visual element as well to sort of tie us all in together. So this is how I would actually play it in context. Another hugely important aspect of my job is being able to transition from the role of a member of the cello section to that of a soloist. The orchestral repertoire is full of really prominent, beautiful, challenging cello solos, and often you only have a few seconds to make it sound the way you want, as opposed to where if you were a soloist who tours and plays with different orchestras, you often have an entire half hour to sort of show your stuff and display your playing for the audience. But in so many cases, this little small, delicate, tricky solo will just sort of come out of the woodwork, and suddenly there you are, and you have to project a different side of your playing to the audience. This also means, when you audition, if you audition for a principal position in an orchestra, the list of repertoire that you have to play is going to look very different than the list if you're auditioning for a section position. That is at least half of the job, even if you spend more than half the time more or less being a member of the section. And then sometimes a nice perk of being the principal cellist is that on occasion you get to appear in front of the orchestra as a soloist in a concerto setting, which also has its own joys and challenges. The other aspect of the job of a principal cellist that I wasn't necessarily aware of when I first started professionally in this role is sort of on the personnel side. When you're in school and you're taking auditions, it's rare that a teacher will coach you on how to deal with your colleagues and how to, yes, lead, but also be a respectful colleague. Because at the end of the day, you can take any given cello section, probably anywhere in the world, and you'll find that those 9, 10, 11, 12 players cover a pretty wide spectrum of personality types and behaviors. And I feel like part of my job is to, even if everyone isn't best friends with each other, we should sound like we could be when we play. So there is definitely a negotiation of personalities and trying to deal with issues that come up. And music is very personal for every person in the orchestra. It's what we do, it's who we are. That's something really unique about what we do for a living. And I think the other side of that is that there's going to be some inherent tension when we don't all agree. Regardless, we have to work together as a section, as part of the larger string section, and as part of the entire orchestra on stage to put together a cohesive, beautiful, unified product. So if I were to sum it all up, I would say being a successful principal of really any section in the orchestra, it really comes down to being the most prepared person, not only physically, like having all the notes in your hands, but also psychologically being prepared for when you have to suddenly change gears and play a solo and then jump back into the section. Being a good colleague, trying to understand different people's perspectives and opinions, and being open-minded. And really, if there was one thing, I would just say, when in doubt, lead by example. If you don't have to say it, if you can show it, that's always the best way to go about it. I hope that's helpful for anyone who aspires to be a section leader or really in a leadership role in any ensemble, whatever that might be in the future.